Good evening and welcome to our weekly class on the weekly Parsha. Before we go into the Parsha itself, tonight, which is the beginning of the day tomorrow, of course, is the 7th day of the month of Adar. This is Adar Rishon, the first Adar, because we have 2 months of the same name. But the significance of the 7th day of Adar is that it is the day in which Moses passed away, and it's the same day that he was born 120 years earlier. One of the characteristics of a tzaddik, of a righteous person, is that their lives are perfect, that they fulfill their mission perfectly. And the way to illustrate that, which happens to some great people, not all of course, is that they're actually born and they pass away on the same day. And we find this with other tzaddikim as well. But Moshe Rabbeinu is the model for that, which indicates that he had fulfilled his purpose and did what his soul came into this world to accomplish. And the 7th of Adar is a very special day for more than one reason. Yes, of course, it's the day that Moses passed away. It's the day that he was born. But it's the day that is responsible for our survival. How so? Well, the Talmud tells the story that Haman, whose desire was to annihilate all the Jewish people, didn't know when he should designate the time for that annihilation. And he was very superstitious, so he cast lots, which, by the way, is the reason why the holiday of Purim is called Purim, which means lots. And the lots determined that the month in which it would be most opportune, at least this is how he interpreted it, would be the month of Adar. Why Adar? Because it's an unlucky month for the Jewish people. Why is it unlucky? Because that's the month in which Moses, the greatest Jew, the greatest person that ever lived, who represents the essence of what it means to be a Jew, the Torah is referred to as the Torah of Moses. That's the month in which he left this world, and therefore Haman concluded that this must be a very unlucky month for the Jewish people because they lost the most important Jew that they ever had. Little did he know, the Talmud concludes, that Moses was also born on that same day in the month of Adar, so his birth atones for his passing. In other words, whatever negative a characteristic can be attributed to Moses because of his passing was neutralized because it's also the day in which he came into this world. And when Moses came into this world, unlike any other child, Moses radiated light. Because normally it says, the King Solomon says that the day a person leaves this world is better than the day he comes into this world. Why? Because when you come into this world, nobody knows what kind of a life you're going to lead. It's up in the air. You have free choice, and you could utilize your life for good or for the opposite. But when a person leaves this world, you already know what the person stood for, what he accomplished, what he did right, and how he fulfilled his purpose for being in this world. So the day the person passes away, in a way, is better, is more positive than the day he enters the world. That's true, generally speaking. Moses was the exception, because as soon as he was born, it was clear that Moses was going to bring light to the whole world because he actually brought light on the day that he was born. So because Moses was born in this month, that's what thwarted Haman's plan and led to the defeat of Haman and his cohorts and the holiday of Purim, which is the most joyous holiday of the year. So we can all trace it back to Moses, who was born in this month and also passed away in this month. Now, the 7th of Adar is not a happy day, per se, even though it's the day that he was born, because he passed away on this day, and Moses did not want to leave this world. This is how the Rabbi explains the question, why is it that Lag BaOmer, the holiday that occurs between Pesach and Shavuos, is a joyous day, even though it marks the passing of the great Kabbalist, the author of the Zohar, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And yet the 7th of Adar is known as a sad day, and some people fast on that day. The Chevra Kadisha, the burial society, has a custom in many communities to fast on this day, the 7th day of Adar, when Moses passed away. Why is it a sad day, whereas Lag BaOmer, where another great person, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, passes away then? And the answer the Rebbe gives is because Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, on the day that he passed away, told us that he wants this day to be celebrated because this is the day that he referred to as Hilula, a wedding, because his soul reunited with its source, which is the heavenly source. So since he asked this day to be a day of joy, we celebrate it. 7th of Adar is a day that Moses did not want to happen. He wanted to cross over the Jordan and enter into the promised land, and that was denied. And he did not merit to cross over to be present in the land of Israel. So Moses' passing was a sad event, and that's why it's not a day of celebration. Although it's not a sad day in the practice, in other ways of practicing, only for those who fast on this day, but it's one of the days in Adar, which is entirely a month of great joy. So that's a little bit about tonight, tomorrow, the 7th of Adar, the day that Moses was born and the day that he passed away. The Parsha, the portion of the Torah that we're reading this week, is the portion of Truma. Truma is about the Mishkan, the construction of what they call in English the Tabernacle. An easier way of referring to it is that it's the portable sanctuary that was built in the desert and transported with them in their wanderings, the 42 wanderings in the desert, and later on when they crossed over into the land of Israel, they crossed the Jordan, they set up the Mishkan in a place called Gilgul, and it stayed there for 14 years. Only afterwards did they build a more permanent sanctuary in the city of Shiloh that was the site of a semi-permanent structure that lasted for 369 years, I believe. And after that, the temple moved to 2 other places until finally it was built by King Solomon in Jerusalem. And from then onward, that's the only location for the temple. When Mashiach comes and builds the 3rd Beis HaMikdash, it will be in that very site where the first 2 temples stood. At any rate, the Mishkan is the portable tabernacle, the portable sanctuary, and the instructions for it are given in this week's Torah portion. And there's something very remarkable about the Mishkan. If we go through the entire Torah, all of the 5 books of Moses, and even the other books, there is no subject that is received as extensive treatment as much as the construction of the Mishkan. The entire Parsha of Truma, this week's Parsha, is about the instructions how to build a Mishkan and its vessels. The entire portion of Tetzaveh, virtually the entire portion, is about the Bigdei Kahuna, the priestly garments that the priest had to wear when they did the service in the Mishkan and later on in the Beis HaMikdash. The Parsha afterwards, Kisisa, has a section where it talks about the Mishkan. It's a small section, but the next 2 Parshas, Vayakel Pekudei, are entirely about how they implemented the instructions of the Mishkan and building the Mishkan itself and all its vessels and all the priestly garments. Why is it that the Torah devotes so much attention for the construction of the Mishkan when there are so many other very, very intricate areas of Jewish law that are covered in one verse or several verses, and yet the building of the Mishkan, which is not even practical anymore, we're never going to have to build the Mishkan. When Mashiach comes, we're going to be building the Beis HaMikdash, although the Mishkan is still extant, it's still around, it's buried beneath the Temple Mount, and when Mashiach comes, maybe it will be erected, maybe not, but it's certainly not going to be the focal point. The focal point will be the Beis HaMikdash. Why so much attention is given to a subject that has no practical relevance, it would seem, and that is not really something that can compare to all the laws in the Torah that are given very scant treatment. And this is given 4.5 sections of the Torah are devoted to the building of the Mishkan. So one of the answers is based on a comment that Rashi makes, quoting the Talmud, when Eliezer, the servant of Abraham, comes to the land where Abraham's family resided to find a mate, a wife for Yitzchak, for Isaac, Abraham's son. So Eliezer comes there, he travels there, and he comes there, and he says to himself, and he says to God, that if I will ask a young girl to give me water, and she offers not only to give me, but also to give my camels, I'll know that's the right one. And that's exactly what happens. And the Torah tells that in detail, what he said and what she did. And then he comes to her father, Besuel, and Lavan, her brother. And Eliezer repeats the whole story with some variations. It's repeated over and over again. And Rashi anticipates the question, why is it that the Torah devotes so much attention to this story when so many laws that were given to the Jewish people are only mentioned very briefly? And Rashi answers, quoting the Talmud, that from this we see that the stories that happen with the patriarchs and even their servants are more precious than even the laws that were given to the children for the descendants, namely the Jewish people. In other words, when something is very dear to you, when there's a lot of love, you will repeat it over and over again. When someone is in love with someone and they talk about their passion for the other, they could repeat themselves over and over. They'll say, I love you, over and over again. But I already know that you love me. I already know that there's love there. But when there's love, there's no limit to how many times you're going to repeat it. Someone receives a letter from a loved one who he had not seen in months or years. The letter doesn't have anything profound in it necessarily, and yet you will read the letter and take it out every now and then and read it again and cherish it because it represents the love, which is such a powerful emotion. And when there's a powerful emotion, repetition is not a problem. It's not an obstacle. On the contrary, the more you repeat it, I think I mentioned this in an earlier class, that the Torah is referred to as a song. What's the difference between a song and prose? When you give a lecture and after you finish the lecture, you repeat the whole lecture again, you're going to lose your audience. You can't repeat the same lecture over and over again. If you want to repeat it over again, you have to leave a lot of time before repeating it. When it comes to a song, people want to hear the same song over and over again. Why is this song different? Because a song touches a part of the soul that doesn't have the limits that prose has. When something is very dear to you, when something is very precious and very deep and profound, repetition is not a problem. And that's why the Torah repeats the story of the patriarchs, because God is in love with the patriarchs, because they were so unique and so special. The same thing can be said and is applied to the Mishkan. What is the Mishkan, the Tabernacle, the portable sanctuary? What did it represent? Well, you have to give it a little bit of a background. Moses went up on the mountain after God declared the 10 Commandments, and he went up on the mountain to get the tablets. When he comes down, and what does he see? He sees the Jewish people worshiping a golden calf because they miscalculated Moses' descent from the mountain, and he shatters the tablets. And God was extremely upset and threatens to destroy the Jewish people. And Moses goes up on the mountain for another 40 days and 40 nights, doesn't eat, doesn't drink, doesn't sleep, and beseeches God to forgive the people. And God says, okay, I'll give them another chance. Bring up the sapphire stone, and I'll give you another set of 10 commandments. And he's there for 40 days and 40 nights. And he comes down at the end of those 40 nights, 40 days, and that was Yom Kippur. And he comes down with a second set of tablets. What exactly, and right after that, Moses receives the order, according to what opinion, to build the Mishkan, to build the sanctuary. What exactly was going on? What was going on is that God and the Jewish people were in a relationship, in a marriage of sorts. And when they worshiped the golden calf, that threatened to sever the relationship between God and the Jewish people. When God finally says, I'm going to forgive them and I'll give them a second set of tablets, that meant that God had forgiven them and that the relationship was being restored. But you didn't really know for sure that the relationship is intact until, in case of a husband and wife where they're separated, until they return to live in the same home. Well, by building the mishkan, that was God's way of saying, I'm going to dwell amongst you. As it says in the Torah, make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in them. That means God saying, through the sanctuary, I will show that I am no longer going to be away from them. Even if I forgive them, sometimes you can forgive someone, but you can say, look, I forgive you for what you did, but I don't want to have a relationship with you. It's safer if we keep a distance from one another. God says, no, I'm not going to keep a distance. So the Mishkan was the most dramatic manifestation of God's willingness to be in a marriage with the Jewish people in spite of the distance that we created through the golden calf. There's no greater joy, no greater feeling of intimacy than the story of the building of the Mishkan, of the portable sanctuary. And that's why the Torah repeats it over and over again, because it is so precious. It is so special. Now, the Torah begins by God saying to Moses, speak to the children of Israel and have them take a contribution from me. What's going on over here? Take a contribution. It should have said give a contribution. That's a question asked by all the commentators. Why is it v'yiklu they should take and not give? So one of the answers is that when a person gives tzedakah, gives charity, he thinks or she thinks that he or she is giving what is theirs, and they're giving it away out of the goodness of their heart to a needy person, a needy cause, a needy organization, and that they are giving. The response to that is no, you're not giving what's yours. God gave you whatever he gave you as a trustee, so you should hold it in your possession until such time when you give it to the person for whom it was really intended. It was really intended for that poor individual. It was really intended for that poor organization, a needy organization who needs the money to support Jewish education or the like. It's in your hands because God wants to give you the credit for giving, but you're not the one who's giving. What you're doing is you're taking whatever the contribution is that belongs to someone else, and you're giving it away to the one for whom it was intended. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation the Rabbi gives, it says that when you give it, you should give it li. Li means for me, for my sake. When you give tzedakah, you should do it with intention that you're doing it for God's sake. Now, when you give the tzedakah, it's very easy to say, I'm doing it because God wants me to do it. But what about the one who takes it, the recipient? The recipient thinks, you know what? I'm just taking something I need for myself. I'm a needy person. I'm a poor person. And I have to depend on charity, on a handout. There's nothing lofty. There's nothing noble about receiving. That's what one would think. So the Torah says, no, even when you receive a yiklu, even when you take it, you can take it in two ways. And one way you could take it is, I'm a poor person, I'm needy, I have to depend on you, so I'm going to lower myself and I'm going to receive it. But then there's a more sophisticated way of looking at a person who has to be on the receiving end. If you wouldn't be on the receiving end, then the person who's on the giving end would not be able to give because there's no one to receive. By you receiving it, you are legitimizing and validating that person. As I mentioned many times, when you give someone, let's say you give a needy person $1,000. $1,000 is a nice donation, but it's finite. What that person, by receiving it, is giving you, that person is justifying your existence. He's validating your very existence and justifying your presence in this world, because we are in this world to give. And we couldn't possibly give unless there's someone on the receiving end. So no one wants to be on the receiving end. But when a person is on the receiving end, they have to realize that they are doing much more than just receiving for themselves. They are doing it for the sake of making that person a legitimate human being who has a purpose in this world and has fulfilled his purpose. So that's why the Torah says you should take it from me, for my sake, that your taking should not be a reluctant taking because you're on the receiving end and you have no other choice, but it's your way of really giving to the person and fulfilling enabling the person to fulfill the mitzvah. The Hebrew word truma has two translations. Truma is the name of the parsha because it's the very theme of the whole parsha. Truma means a separation. You're separating some of what is yours and giving it away. And truma also comes from the word to uplift. You're elevating it. When you give tzedakah, when you give money or whatever it is that you give for a holy cause, for a righteous cause, you're actually taking something from yours and separating it, but you're also elevating it. There's nothing more powerful to elevate whatever it is that you have than giving tzedakah. When you give tzedakah, let's say you give, by Jewish law, you're mandated to give 10% of the net income, preferably 20%. What you're doing, you're only giving 10 or 20%. What about the other 90 or 80%? You uplift all the others. Everything that you own is now becoming holy. It's uplifted and has true value. There's a famous story that is somewhat connected to this idea. One of the great sages, I heard the story about different people, but it's a story that could have happened with more than one person, who was very close to the king, was an advisor to the king, and the king really trusted him very, very much. But his enemies, this Jew's enemies, plotting against him. So they told the king, this Jew is probably hiding his true wealth. Ask him how much he owns, and you'll see that he's lying. And let's say he was worth $10 million, because he was wealthy. So he said he was worth $1 million, and the king had him arrested because the king did research and they realized that he was worth 10 million, and he only said he's worth $1 million. So he was arrested, but the king felt very bad about this because, after all, this Jew was known for his integrity, for his honesty. So he went to the prison cell to visit him. He said, "I don't understand you, Rabbi. Why did you lie to me? I wouldn't have done anything to you if I knew the truth. And you knew that I could find out the truth. So why did you tell me you were only worth $1 million when you're really worth 10 million? And he said, "No, I'm not worth 10 million because look where I am now in jail. Everything was confiscated. I don't know anything. Then what about the 1 million? Well, that's the 1 million I gave to charity. That is something that I could never lose. You could never take it from me. That's my real possession." In a little bit of a different emphasis, when we give tzedakah, the 9 million that we have, or whatever it is that we have, the 90% that we keep for ourselves, is not real. What's real, what's holy and real, is the 10%. But when you give the 10%, it validates the other 90% as well. Now, the Torah lists the different items that were in the mishkan. It starts off with gold and silver and copper, and then it goes on to different types of dyed wool and so on. There's a list of 13 items. 13 is a very significant number. I know in non-Jewish circles, 13 is an unlucky number. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Well, there's no such thing as a good number or a bad number. Every number could have a positive connotation or a negative connotation. Let's take even the word Mashiach. Can't be anything better than Mashiach. Then, nevertheless, the word Mashiach numerically adds up to 358, and the word Nachash, serpent, also adds up to 358. So you can't say that 358 is a bad number or a good number. It has positive connotations, and it could also have negative. It depends how it's being used. Well, the number 13 is used in so many places for positive things. 13 attributes of mercy, 13 methods of interpreting the Torah, the 13 principles of faith that Maimonides enumerated, and so many other 13s. And of course, we know that a child becomes bar mitzvah at the age of 13. That's a boy. A girl becomes bat mitzvah at the age of 12, which really means that she's entering into her 13th year, whereas the boy has to go through full 13 years. But at any rate, 13 is a significant number. And another significance of 13 is that the word for one in Hebrew, echad, numerically adds up to 13. So when we talk about 13, we're talking about the idea of oneness, of unity. The word for love in Hebrew, ava, also adds up to 13 because ava is what brings people together. Love is what brings different disparate entities together. So what does that have to do with the Mishkan? Because what was the whole purpose of the Mishkan? The whole purpose of the Mishkan is to create a sanctuary, as the Torah says, and I will dwell in them. In them, what do you mean in them? In it should have said. No, it's in them. Through the Mishkan, God's presence permeated the whole world. That the whole world should recognize that there's one God. That's why we pray for the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash. And I know people who will ask the question, why is it so important to build another structure? Don't we have beautiful synagogues all over the world, multi-million edifices? Why is it so important to have the Beis Hamikdash specifically in that place? Because while every synagogue is a holy place, there's only one place in the world where being in that place, you were overcome with a feeling, an overriding feeling of God's presence, that there was nothing else but God. And from there, it spreads out to the whole world. So the 13 items represent the idea of God's oneness that was revealed in the Mishkan, in the sanctuary, both the portable one and then the permanent one in Jerusalem. One could also suggest that a child reaches bar mitzvah, that the child's 13 years, each year contributes one item. And when you reach 13, you have all 13 items that you can build the Mishkan. Because when a child becomes bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, what happens? What exactly happens to the child? The child usually doesn't feel it, but there is something that happens, something spiritual. So our sages tell us that when a child is born, the child is animated by an animal soul. The godly soul starts to enter into the child at the age of 8 days for a bris, for a boy at the bris, and for a girl when her name is given, her Jewish name is given. And by the time that the child reaches 13, the godly soul is fully implemented, fully vested within the person's body. So in other words, what happens at the age of 13, you become a full-fledged Jew because you have all your spiritual resources at hand. So you have 13 years in which you are building this sanctuary. At 13, you become the sanctuary for the divine soul, which experiences this oneness of God. Every one of us has this soul that feels this oneness of God. When the soul comes into the physical body, and we also have an animal soul, that takes away from our appreciation for God's oneness. But the age of bar mitzvah, when you have your full measure of the godly soul, you now become a sanctuary for God. Now, the first instruction, after, say, giving the general instruction to make a sanctuary for me, God says, and I will dwell in them, it starts off with the building of the Aron, of the ark. The ark was to be built out of acacia wood, and it was 2.5 cubits long, and a cubit and a half wide, and a cubit and a half high. 2.5 by 1.5 by 1.5. One of the commentators, known as the Kliyokar, asks, why is it that the ark had half measures, 2.5 by 1.5 by 1.5? Why not 2 and 1 by 1? And the other vessels didn't have all dimensions halves, but when it came to the ark, all the measures were halves. So the answer he gives is that the ark represents the Torah. The ark had the tablets in them, and according to another opinion, had the Torah scroll that Moses wrote. Some say it was in the ark, some say it was on the side of the ark, but it was connected to the ark. And the Torah is something that is so profound that we can never fully fathom its depth and its greatness. And the fact that there are 3 dimensions of half, I think, add another point, that when it comes to knowledge, there are 3 areas of knowledge. There is the length, the width, and the depth. What does that mean in terms of knowledge? There are things that we learn that we have a knowledge of that has breadth that can take us years to master it. When you take any subject in Torah and you want to know everything about that subject, it's such a wide subject. There's so many details. So the breadth of Torah is only half. You can never really master all of the Torah because there's so much. And as time goes on, more and more knowledge of Torah is becoming revealed. Every time a person studies Torah and comes up with a new insight, a new idea that's rooted in the Torah and Torah approach, that expands the vistas, the breadth of Torah. Then there's also the length of Torah. Length means to take Torah and to bring it down from one level to another. A teacher has a deeper understanding and has to bring the knowledge to the student on the student's level. That's taking the Torah and bringing it down. That's the length of Torah. And not everyone has the ability to take ideas, deep and profound ideas, and to transmit it to people on a lower level. For that, you have to have the length of Torah, and no matter who it is, there's always a limit to how far down the chain you can take the Torah. And then there's the depth of Torah. Every topic of Torah has deeper and deeper understanding of it. It says that King Solomon had 3,000 parables. So most people understand it to mean he had a repertoire of parables, of stories, to explain things in Torah. But Chassidus explains that it means that his level of understanding was 3,000 levels higher than any other person. And he had to take it through 3,000 steps to take it from his level of depth to the level of other people. So that's the length of Torah, that it has its limits. It required that he would use 3,000 parables to get it down. But some people don't have those parables, and they could never really bring it down. But also it indicates the depth of his knowledge of Torah. That's why the ark had 3 dimensions: the breadth, the length, and the depth. And each of those dimensions was had a half in it to show us that Torah is infinite in all those 3 areas in terms of its breadth, its length, and its depth. Later on, the Torah speaks about the ark, the menorah, rather. And one thing that most people are not aware of, everyone knows that the menorah looks like a semicircle, but Rashi, based on the very wording of the Torah, says that the branches of the menorah were diagonal, not round. They would go from the center all the way up to the top. They were on a slant, diagonally, and so does Maimonides say the same thing. But not only did Maimonides say it, he actually drew a picture of it, that the branches of the menorah were not round. The fact that the Arch of Titus has a round menorah is not a proof that that's what the menorah looked like, because there were other menorahs that people used in those days. And also, the Arch of Titus depicts the menorah with a dragon on it, a snake on it. Never had that. It doesn't have legs, and the menorah in the Torah had legs. So it's not a real representation of a menorah. And anyhow, it could be that the Romans, all of their menorahs were round. So when they depicted a menorah, they followed their own vision of a menorah. Now, the menorah had a ramp. In order to light it, to reach the top of the menorah, to kindle it, there was a ramp that had 3 steps. And the question is asked, just 2 weeks ago, we read that when you build the altar, to get on top of the altar, you should use a ramp and not steps. You're not allowed to use steps. You have to use a ramp. Whereas the menorah, to get up to the top of the menorah to light it, you did have steps. What's the difference? Why over here where you were not allowed to have steps when it came to the ark, to the Mizbeach, the altar, when it came to the menorah, you had to have steps. So one way of explaining it is as follows. When the altar was used for sacrifices were brought primarily for people who had sinned. Certain kinds of sins require certain kinds of atonement with sacrifices. When the Kohen, the priest, who was the spiritual individual who was bringing the offering, and he's bringing the offering on behalf of a sinner, he might think of himself as, I'm higher, I'm up there, and I'm lowering myself to help you, sinner, come up to where you should be going. It's a sign of arrogance and condescension. And the Torah says, don't go up on steps. The Hebrew word for steps is ma'alot. Ma'alot means higher levels. Don't call yourself higher. Don't assume that you're holier than the other person, even though the other person is the sinner and you are the Kohen, the righteous Kohen. Don't ever look down, especially when you're dealing with a person who's brokenhearted because he did the sin, he regrets it, and you're rubbing it in, making him feel horrible. That's an improper approach and attitude. You can't use condescension. The Kohen has to be humble, so you don't have steps, which is the symbol of you're rising up to a higher point. You consider yourself superior and higher. But when it comes to the menorah had the opposite purpose. It was not in order to atone for sinners. It was to kindle the souls, to ignite the souls of every Jew. That's why the menorah had 7 branches, because there were 7 character traits corresponding to 7 different approaches that Jewish people have in the service of God. And the Kohen's role was to ignite that so that the flame of every soul rises up. And to symbolize the idea that the purpose is to rise up, you have steps, which again, the word steps, ma'alot, means elevations. You're going higher and higher, and you're bringing people higher and higher. So there was nothing wrong with having steps. On the contrary, that was the whole objective, to raise people up to higher and higher levels. As I said before, the menorah had 7 branches, and it also had many decorations on it. It had flowers, it had something look like an apple, and it also had goblets. And there's something very interesting about the way the goblets were depicted by Maimonides on the menorah that he drew. That normally when you would draw a picture of a goblet, you would draw the goblet where the base of it was on the bottom and the opening, the wide opening, is on top. But Maimonides, when he depicts the menorah's goblets, the goblet was the bottom of it, the base of it was on top, and the open side was on the bottom. Why did he draw it that way? It's counterintuitive. Anyway, I'd ask anyone to draw a picture of a goblet, you would draw it with a base on the bottom, the narrow base on the bottom, and the opening on top. So the Rabbi once explained, based on what the Book of Kings tells us about the first temple, that the windows were in such a way where the opening of the window was narrow and got wider on the outside, which is if you want light inside the building, you would make the opening wide in the inside. So our sages tell us that the reason it was done that way is because God did not need any light in the Beis HaMikdash. It was unnecessary to have light, to have physical light. The reason why they lit the menorah was not to illuminate the Beis HaMikdash, but that the light from the Beis HaMikdash should be emanated outward. So that's why the windows were in such a way to indicate that the light was going to the outside, and that's why it was wider on the outside. The same manner, the Rebbe says, applies to the goblet. What's a goblet? A goblet has 2 positions. Number one, it receives the liquid. You have a goblet to recite the Kiddush Friday night. You pour the wine in, and you hold the goblet where the opening is on top, otherwise it would pour out. But then you pour, after you finish the Kiddush, you pour the wine, and you turn the goblet upside down. So that's why Maimonides, when he depicted the goblet, he says, what's the whole purpose of the menorah? The purpose of the menorah is to bring light to the outside, to pour the liquid, the energy, the spiritual energy, to pour it outward. It should reach the other, it should reach other people. It should go outside of the Beis HaMikdash. That's why the goblet was upside down.